And that haggis. Now, Gonzalo Lira is actually under bombardment. The building next to him was hit just yesterday. As I understand it, on another broadcast earlier today, he disappeared halfway through because all his lights went out. It is extraordinary that this man has the clarity and the courage to continue to tell the truth about what's happening in Ukraine. He's in Kharkov, but he joins you now for the global audience that loves to see him so much. Gonzalo, the fall of Solidar, the potential now evacuation of Bakhmut, the extraordinary bombardment of virtually every important Ukrainian city over the last 48 hours. The war has begun to turn big time, hasn't it?
Yes, it most certainly has. And first of all, thank you so much for having me on. And thank you so much for your very, very kind words. You know that I'm a huge fan of yours, and I will always thank you for, paying attention to me and looking after me and that unpleasantness back in April. And in fact, you mentioned that the building next to mine had been struck. It wasn't yesterday. It was back in early September when the missile strikes started happening. And so, yeah, I got great photographs, but I can't show them because they give away my current location. But privately, I'm happy to send you the pictures because they're pretty cool. Anyway, the point is, what's going on now in the front in the Donbass region is that you see, since the start of this war, the Kiev regime installed basically 3 lines of defense, and the Russians have been grinding through them. Now, the first line of defense was Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Popasnaya, that line, which was breached in July 1st, I believe, of 2022. And here, now the Russians have been grinding through the second line of defense, which is the Bakhmut line. And Soledar is essentially a suburb. It's a separate town, but basically a suburb of Bakhmut. It's a city or town of 10,000 people before the start of this conflict. And it mattered because, you see, this line of Bakhmut-Soledar, north-south line, basically was the second and perhaps the strongest line of defense that the Kiev regime had installed. They'd been building these defenses for the past 7-8 years since the signing of Minsk II agreements. And so the capture of Soledar is a very important moment. It's basically the penultimate town of the penultimate defensive line. You see, once they captured Soledar, they have essentially encircled the city of Bakhmut. There's only one road of escape for Bakhmut. And what the Zelensky regime is doing is that they are actually trying to hold on to Bakhmut by pouring more troops into it, which is incredibly demoralizing because the troops realize that they're going into certain death. And so, they're just throwing away lives willy-nilly. A lot of people are saying in the West that Soledar and Bakhmut don't matter. They do enormously, because you see, this was the centerpiece of the defensive line to hold back any Russian onslaught. And once your defensive lines are fully breached, there's nothing holding them back. Okay. And furthermore, the city of Bakhmut is a very important transportation hub. Several highways and several train lines cross through it. And so that's why, excuse me, it was a centerpiece of the second defensive line of the Kiev regime. Now, after the Russians finally breach through this second line, once they have captured Bakhmut, which will not be tomorrow, it'll take a few days, if perhaps not even a couple of weeks. But once they finally do capture it, the only further line, the third defensive line, is on the city of Kramatorsk. But this third line is the weakest of the lines. And beyond that, once they have overrun Kramatorsk, which would be inevitable because it's much easier to overrun it than the current Bakhmut line, then there's going to be basically clear sailing. I mean, just a flat terrain with no defensive positions between Kramatorsk and the city of Dnipro, formerly Dnipropetrovsk, which is on the Dnieper River. This would essentially mean that the Russians would capture the bulk of eastern Ukraine. This would be a huge deal. And the way things are going, this is an inevitability because Soledar has been captured. Bakhmut is about to be captured. It's encircled by three sides. Of the three roads leading out of it, two of them are controlled by the Russians, either fire control or they have outright possession of the roads. So the forces in Bakhmut have only a single road out. It's not under fire control, but it eventually will be under fire control. And so once Bakhmut falls, the next line will be Kramatorsk, which is far weaker than the Bakhmut line. And once the Russians overrun that line, then that would be the ball game insofar as eastern Ukraine is concerned. And so there's a lot of speculation going on insofar as the offensives that are gaining pace, because it's clear that the Russians are preparing a big winter offensive, but nobody's quite sure where. At this time, it's credibly estimated that 650,000 Russian soldiers are on the borders of Ukraine. A big grouping is in southern Belarus, just across the border from Ukraine, from the northern border, the northwestern border of Ukraine. Another big grouping is in the Belgorod Oblast, which is literally 50 kilometers away from my position. And then there's the third grouping that's in the Donbass region and the south of the country. It's sort of like spread out. It's not as concentrated as the other two. And so nobody's quite sure what the Russians have in mind. Of course, the Russians probably have a very clear idea of what they're about to do, but they're just not telling anybody. And there's, operational security has been incredibly good. So nobody has any clue, any realistic idea of what the Russians are going to do next. But we have reached a key moment in this battle, in this war, rather. See, the breaching of the second line, and the fact that Soledar has fallen and Bakhmut is all but done. It's inevitable. There's no way to save it. No number of troops will save it, because the defensive fortifications have already been destroyed. And so even if more soldiers flood into it, they will not be in positions to defend themselves from the Russian onslaught. So Bakhmut is done. Okay, it's just a matter of time. And so from that perspective, you realize that we have tipped over insofar as the conflict in its totality is concerned. Because if we think of the conflict starting on February 24th, as initially it was an expeditionary force that the Russians launched to essentially scare the Zelensky regime into negotiations. And that failed into the spring. And so in the summer, they reorganized and they started really in September for this grinding, constant offensive. Well, we're seeing the culmination of that grinding offensive that has just ground down the Ukrainian armed forces. And so now we're at the position where the Russians will achieve some sort of breakthrough. Now, how this plays out exactly, like I said, nobody knows. But this is the time to start paying very close attention to the things that are going on.
Yeah, the Washington Post today speculates from informed sources, they say, that Zelensky will relent to the head of the Ukrainian armed forces' demand that there should be a withdrawal from Bakhmut rather than wasting more men and more material in the city. As you say, there's still one road out if they wanted to take it. And on your point about the Russian offensive, the winter offensive that is obviously coming somewhere, the British Security Service, MI6, 2 days ago or 3 days ago, warned everyone that in the next couple of weeks this offensive was going to be launched. But as you say, nobody seems to know where. Now, I'm tantalized by the Belarus buildup. Because, of course, a crossing from Belarusia would bring Belarus into the war proper for a start, but would run the risk of confrontation with Polish forces that might very well enter the west of the country. As you know better than me, Poland regards much of Western Ukraine as actually being theirs in any case. I wonder if you think a movement across the Belarusian border is A, a real possibility, and B, what would its consequence be?
Okay, that's a very good question. Now, is it possible? Certainly. I mean, you do have to keep in mind that the Russians, when they position troops wherever, and this is true for every military, whenever they position troops anywhere, they have multiple possibilities of where to put those forces and what to do with them. They might put some troops there just as a holding mission to pin down some opposing army, or they might put them there to attack, or they could just put them there and have both plans ready to roll whatever circumstances dictate what's most favorable. Now, insofar as Russia attacking from Belarus, which would, of course, bring in Belarus into this conflict, and the Poles. Okay, so we have multiple problems going on with the Poles. Recently, President Duda of Poland was in Lviv, and he was received like a rock star, like like a celebrity. And you have to keep in mind the city of Lviv in Western Ukraine is historically Polish. It's barely, I want to say something like 60 or 80 kilometers from the border. I actually rode that road from the border of Poland and Ukraine to the city of Lviv on my motorcycle. But I forgot. But it's something like that. It's not far, is my point. And so the issue becomes, will the Poles decide to put troops on the ground and take what they consider to be historically Polish territory? Because the city of Lviv and that area, geographic area, the Galicia, they consider it theirs. Part of Galicia also extends into what is southwestern Belarus as well. And so will they go into it? Now, it's not clear if they have the troops to do that. I'm frozen. I don't know if you guys can see me.
Yes, we can, yes.
Okay, great. What happens is that the Poles, at this time, they have an army of 150,000 men. I mean, that's the Polish army today. But what has happened is that as of November, they did a call-up of 200,000 men. These were, untrained men who are going to have to be trained. And so that'll take a good minimum 6 months, closer to 9 months to a year. But clearly, the Poles are getting ready for some conflict. I mean, they wouldn't be calling up 200,000 men, i.e., more than their current armed force, unless they were preparing for war. They've also gone forward with a lot of weapons purchases from the West, weapons that will be delivered into 2024 and 2025 and forward on. Tanks, helicopters, artillery, especially because artillery is proving itself to be the god of war once again. And so the Poles are clearly getting ready for some sort of military conflict. I mean, you don't invest that amount of money and time and effort into doubling your army unless you're very serious about getting something that you want, militarily speaking. So the issue will become for the Russians a very delicate political balance and a timing issue. See, on the one hand, they don't want to provoke the Poles, but on the other hand, they want to wrap this up before the Poles have an actual army that could cause problems for them. And when I say they want to wrap this up, I mean that they want to capture the entirety of Ukraine. You do have to keep in mind, if you have, as the Russians do, if you have an army of 650,000 men surrounding a country, which is what the Russians have at this point, 650,000 men is not for a war. 650,000 men is for the occupation of the entire country. I mean, that's clearly what that army is about. Okay, so the Russians probably already have a clear idea that what they have to do is they have to capture all of Ukraine before the Poles are in a position to do anything about it, militarily speaking. Because you do have to remember something that's key. The Russians no longer trust the West at all, especially with the revelations by Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande. Angela Merkel, the former Chancellor of Germany, Francois Hollande, the former President of France, both of them were in power in 2015 when they negotiated the Minsk II agreements that were passed by the UN Security Council, which gave a pathway to peace in Ukraine insofar as the Donbass region is concerned. And both Hollande and Merkel have said in their interviews, recent interviews, they have said that they had no intention of implementing those agreements and that they were just a way to buy time to arm Ukraine. Now, this has gone over in Russia like a lead balloon because they look at this and they say, oh, so any agreement we sign with these people will not be honored. And it's just a cynical ploy to rearm the Ukrainians. So therefore, we cannot negotiate with the West, or much less with the Zelensky regime, insofar as a ceasefire. We have to go for broke. We have to go and capture the whole country. I mean, that's what's happened because of these revelations that nobody in the Western media is talking about. The fact that Merkel and Hollande said that the Minsk II agreements were just a way to buy time and that they were signed in an insincere, practically fraudulent manner, that has gone over terribly with Russia. And the Kremlin in particular, they basically realize we cannot negotiate with them because any agreement we sign, any peace deal we sign, isn't going to be worth the paper it's printed on. So ultimately, we have to capture the whole country. I mean, this is a key point that people have to understand. The Russians are not going to negotiate. They're not going to stop. And for the Russians, since this is an existential crisis, they're going to put everything necessary to win. And the Russians, they have a lot of flaws, like we all do. But, I've said this before, the Italians are great at food and the French are great at fashion. But the Russians, they're good at war and they're going to win this. And it's an inevitability. The only question for the Russians is they will have to accelerate the pace of this at some point to prevent the Poles from coming into Ukraine, as they are clearly intending to do. Because this tour by President Duda in Lviv and this buildup of military forces by the Poles, they're not doing it by chance or just for funsies. They're doing it because they have their eye on Galicia, or the Ukraine part of Galicia. They have their eye on the city of Lviv, which is, as I said, is an important historical city for the Poles. And so the Russians want to make sure that Poland does not get in. And so that's why I think that the Russians are going to have to accelerate this. I've read a number of commentators and very astute individuals, and many of them seem to be thinking that the Russians probably have as a timetable the 1st of September to have this totally wrapped up. But this is pure speculation, so don't take this part to the bank. I mean, I just want to emphasize that. But It's reasonable. It's a reasonable speculation that the Russians will want to be done by the 1st of September to beat the Poles insofar as rearming and remanning their army. Because, like I said, the Poles have a current army of 150,000, and they are more than doubling it. It's 133%. That's the growth in this one call-up that they've done. And there seems to be even more call-ups in Poland in the pipes, in the legalistic pipeline. And so we'll see what happens. But Poland is becoming an issue. And finally, and sorry to bring this, to keep on ranting, but there's another issue too, that the West and the Americans, they recognize that the Zelensky regime is, it's falling apart militarily. So I have speculated on my own YouTube channel, and I think that this is reasonable, and you will have to correct me if you think I'm wrong, but my thinking is that the Americans and NATO generally realize that the Zelensky regime militarily is no match for the Russians. And so they might be deliberately positioning the Poles as the next proxy to face the Russians and, sacrifice the Poles on the Russian anvil, if you will. And I think that might be in the cards, that the West is sort of like the Washington is egging on the Poles into this direction of direct conflict between Poland and Russia, probably as a kind of like a go it alone kind of thing, where it's just the Poles against the Russians, and the Poles will not be able to trigger Article 5. But something along these lines, it seems reasonable that they're trying to suck in Poland into this conflict, because what the Americans want to avoid at all costs is that they want to avoid American lives, American boots on the ground. They want to avoid that at all costs. And so if they can get the Poles to fight the Russians for them, which is what they are doing with the Ukrainians, they are getting the Ukrainians to fight the Russians for them. It's sort of like what these people are up to, the kind of insincerity and despicable callousness that the people in the West, the NATO people, the Pentagon people, the State Department people, that's how they treat human lives, because of their own petty little ambitions and their desire for more money and more resources.
Well, look, it's certainly the case that if you like the core of the EU, Germany, the Benelux, France, Italy, to some extent, are going to have to make a decision soon as to whether they're going to be dragged into a world war by these yapping little former Soviet republics and satellites, like the Baltic states and like satellite states like Poland, who are gripped with a visceral hatred of Russia, of the Soviet Union, and so on, feelings which don't really exist in Germany, France, Italy, Holland, Belgium, etc., because we were getting along quite happily, using Russian gas very cheaply, very dependably, and we were not seeking to refight the last years, the last decades before the collapse of the Soviet Union. But for people like these Baltic republics, people like the Poles, they have scores to settle with Moscow. And the question for, if you like, the classic pillars of Europe, like Germany and France, is, are they going to be led? Is the tail going to wag the dog? Or is the dog going to wag the tail? We'll have to talk about that another time. But I wanted to ask you finally, Gonzalo, there's a lot of Ukrainians in exile, usually the ones with the big BMWs. I had a run-in with some of them just this very day. There's a lot of Ukrainians been killed. There's a lot of Ukrainians already in the army. There's a lot, as the mothers and wives were demonstrating in Kiev today, a lot of missing Ukrainian service personnel who haven't been accounted for, are not admitted as dead. But there's also now a draft, it's quite clear from some of the pictures and video, a draft of very young children in Ukrainian military uniform, and very old men, even older than me, in uniform now, in military roles. That seems to indicate a scraping of the barrel by Zelensky. Is he running out of soldiers?
Nobody really knows, but the fact that we've seen a lot of videos that indisputably proves that, little boys of 16, 15 years old, wearing a military uniform and carrying a weapon. And we've also seen older men, men who are clearly in their late 40s, 50s, killed. I've seen some videos of Ukraine soldiers who are dead, and they've lost their helmets, and they're bald like us older guys. We all get balder, and why do you think I wear a cap? And we all get bolder, and we can instantly tell, oh, that guy's older. That guy's in his 40s. And you were seeing a lot of that, and it's despicable. And nobody really knows the numbers, because the Kiev regime is very, very cagey about the number of its losses. They have propagandized the people into thinking that the losses amount to, maybe 15, maybe 20,000 dead, but it's much, much more. The fact is, Ursula von der Leyen let slip in her speech that at least 100,000 had been killed. This was a month or so ago. But the actual number, nobody really knows, but credible estimates of people who have been on top of the numbers and trying to get the numbers from different ways, they're saying that it's way above 125,000 killed. And a lot of people are saying it's closer to 150,000 killed. And so far as wounded, incapacitated, because there are wounded and who could be patched up and sent back to the front. And then there are wounded who are just not going to go back. They've lost a limb or whatnot. You're talking maybe 180 to 220,000 wounded, incapacitated. So altogether, you're talking conservatively, 320,000 men who are out of commission. That's extraordinary numbers we're talking about here. And it seems to be credible. And insofar as the Russian losses, the BBC for a while was very carefully combing through all social media and all Russian news informations and outlets, trying to come up with credible estimates as to the Russian dead. And they stopped doing this back in July, August, I believe, because the numbers they were getting were so low. It didn't fit their narrative. They were only estimating maybe, I think it was the last number was 8,000 men. And currently it's credibly estimated that the Russians, all Russian forces, Wagner PMC, the Chechen fighters, the DPR and LPR militiamen, and the Russian army, they've lost maybe killed in action 20,000. So let's take the conservative figures, the ones that Ursula von der Leyen said, which is 100,000 killed of the Kiev regime, and compare that to the outside number of the total Russian dead, which is 20,000. You're talking a ratio of 5 to 1. Okay, and the general in charge of the Ukraine armed forces, he said that they currently had, as of this was about 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, he said that they currently had 200,000 men. He said this to the Wall Street Journal and The Economist, who did a round of interviews with them, right? They had 200,000 men under arms. And the Russians, it is known that they have 600, 650,000 right now on the borders of Ukraine. So this is an attritional conflict. And ultimately, in an attritional war, what matters is who has the bigger numbers and who can inflict the greater losses. If the Russians are inflicting casualties at a rate of 5 to 1, and on top of that, they have over 3 times the armed force that the Ukraine side has, then it becomes just an inevitability. It's not something that, the outcome is not in dispute. It's just a matter of how we will get to that outcome and in what time frame. I mean, this war ended as a practical matter quite some time ago, in the sense that we know who's going to win. When you're playing some board game or something, perhaps you're playing with your children like Monopoly or something, or you're playing chess with a friend, and there's that moment when you realize, oh, it's over. I lost. I mean, yeah, I can keep on playing, but the result, we know it. That moment has gone. I mean, it's obvious now. The inevitability of this conflict is obvious, but the cost that we inflicted on these boys. I mean, you were talking about, we're talking 15, 16-year-old children. That's unconscionable. I mean, at least, with the old men who are fighting, well, they don't have that much life ahead of them, quite frankly. I mean, it sounds callous, but, at least there's that comfort. They lived a life and then they died in a war. Horrible. But some 16-year-old child, they shouldn't be within 100 kilometers of any kind of combat like that. They're too young. They're babies, because I've seen the videos. It's horrifying, to see these children. And I'm sorry I'm getting... No,
it's
getting sentimental, but you know what I mean?
It's an emotional subject. Gonzalo Lira, as always, much obliged to you. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you again, I hope, before long.